The heart monitor had been screaming for 11 seconds. Then it stopped screaming. That was worse. The flat line stretched across the screen like a sentence. Final, declarative, unmerciful. Dr. Reyes pulled her surgical mask down and let out a breath she had been holding for 4 hours. Her hands, steadier than most people's hands had any right to be after that kind of surgery, trembled slightly at her sides. She looked at the clock on the ICU wall. 2:47 a.m. "We've done everything we can," she said quietly. No one argued with her. The other surgeons stepped back from the table. 2 nurses began the quiet, practiced choreography of shutting things down. Machines that had been fighting alongside them, pumping, pressurizing, monitoring, began to be switched off one by one, like lights going out in a building everyone was leaving. In the hallway outside, 12 men in dark suits stood absolutely still. Not one of them spoke. These were not men who cried publicly. These were men who had stood beside this particular man while cities burned, while rivals fell, while empires shifted. They had watched him walk through rooms that silenced on his entrance. They had seen fear live in the eyes of people who looked at him. None of that mattered now. Against the far wall, a woman wept into her hands. Not his wife. He had never allowed himself a wife. His mother. 71 years old, small, silver-haired, wearing a house dress she had thrown on when the call came at midnight. She had not stopped praying since she arrived. She was still praying now, even as the nurses moved with that particular quiet that meant the fight was over. The monitor held its flat, indifferent tone. Dr. Reyes looked at the clock again. Procedure required it. Documentation required it. Time of death, she began. And then something happened that none of them would be able to explain for the rest of their careers. Before we continue, if stories of miracles, redemption, and powerful men brought to their knees move you, make sure you like this video. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and subscribe for more emotional stories like this one. Now let's go back to the beginning. His name was Dominic Carerra. If you lived in the city, you knew the name the way you knew the name of the mayor, or the name of the river that ran through downtown, or the name of God. Not because you had sought it out, but because it was simply part of the architecture of the place. It was embedded in the walls. He was 44 years old, 6'2". Dark eyes that had a quality people struggled to describe accurately. Not cold, exactly. More like deep. Like looking into a well and not being able to see the bottom, but knowing something lived down there. His legitimate businesses alone were worth an estimated $3 billion. Real estate, private logistics, a chain of high-end restaurants that food critics adored and that Dominic himself never visited. He owned a private island off the coast that he had been to twice. He owned 4 cars he never drove. He owned a penthouse with a view of the entire city that he sometimes stood at for an hour at a time, not drinking, not on his phone, just watching. What he actually cared about was control. Not money, though money came. Not luxury, though luxury surrounded him. Control. The knowledge that in any given situation, he was the one who determined outcomes. That when the variables of a situation aligned themselves, his hand was the one that had arranged them. He had run the Carerra organization since he was 26, when his father had a stroke and Dominic had stepped into the space with a quietness that surprised everyone, and then a precision that terrified them. He did not rule with cruelty for its own sake. He ruled with economy. He used exactly as much force as a situation required, and not 1 ounce more. This made him, paradoxically, more frightening than the men who enjoyed the violence. Those men were predictable. Dominic was not. He had survived 3 attempts on his life before this night. He would not have bet on surviving a 4th. It was a Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. Dominic had attended a private dinner, one of 12 he held each year, rotating through his inner circle, a ritual that was partly social and partly the kind of assessment that looked like socializing. He watched people over food. He listened to how they laughed. He noted what they ordered and whether they ate it. He was in the parking structure beneath the restaurant when the first shot hit the car. Not him. Car. The rear passenger window exploded inward and his driver, a man named Teo who had been with him for 9 years, died before his body had finished reacting to what had happened. Dominic was moving before the second shot came. This was muscle memory, years of it. The body knowing things the mind hadn't caught up to yet. He made it to the stairwell. The explosion came from the level above. A device that had been placed on one of the support columns detonated remotely, timed to cut off his exit. The concussive force threw him against the concrete wall. He felt something go wrong in his left side immediately. A deep, tearing wrongness that his body registered as catastrophic even through the adrenaline. He kept moving. You keep moving or you stop moving forever. Those are the only two options in a moment like that. He made it to the street. He made it 40 feet onto the street. Then he went down. Later, the investigation would determine that 4 men had been involved. Later, the name of the person who had ordered it would become clear to Dominic. But that is a later chapter. On the wet pavement of that Tuesday night, with rain beginning to fall and the sound of his own bodyguards shouting as they poured out of the building, Dominic Carerra lay still and let the dark came fast. The ambulance ride took 9 minutes. Felt like 9 minutes underwater. Dominic was aware of pieces of it. A paramedic's face close to his, voices using numbers he didn't have the context to interpret, the lurching of the vehicle, something cold being pushed into his arm. He was not afraid, which surprised some distant part of him. He was curious. He had always wondered what this would feel like. Felt like being very far away from everything. St. Augustine's Hospital's trauma bay had seen catastrophic injuries before. But the arrival of Dominic Carerra arrived with its own weather system. 12 black SUVs following the ambulance, men in suits pouring out before the vehicles had fully stopped, the trauma bay suddenly full of people who were not medical staff and who made that very clear by their presence alone. Dr. Reyes, who was on trauma call that night, walked through the crowd with the particular authority of someone who understood that in this room right now, she was the only person whose jurisdiction mattered. "Everyone who is not hospital staff out of this room right now," she said, not loudly. She didn't need volume. She had presence. "You can stand in the hallway. You can stand outside. You cannot stand here." One of the men, large jaw like something carved, took a step toward her. "He dies because you delayed us," he said. "And you don't want to know what happens." Dr. Reyes looked at him steadily. "He dies because you're in my way," she said. "And you don't want to know what happens. Move." He moved. The doors swung shut. The real work began. The internal bleeding was the primary problem. The explosion had done structural damage to his torso that the surgeons worked to address with the focused intensity of people who had trained for exactly this kind of impossible situation and still found it, each time, to push against the edges of what was possible. His blood pressure dropped twice in the first hour. The second time, it dropped to a level that made the room go quiet in a particular way. Not panicked quiet, but the quiet of people recalibrating. "He's bleeding faster than we can replace it," one of the surgical residents said. "I know," Dr. Reyes said. His oxygen saturation fell. His heart rhythm, which had been irregular since he arrived, became more irregular. The machines that were supposed to be supporting his body began to report numbers that suggested his body was no longer cooperating with the support. In the hallway, one of the guards, the one who had spoken to Dr. Reyes, pressed his back against the wall and stared at the ceiling. His name was Marco. He had been with Dominic for 11 years. He had a photograph in his wallet of himself and Dominic at a boxing match in Milan, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame. He kept looking at that ceiling like it owed him something. Dominic's mother sat in a plastic chair and held her rosary and moved her lips without sound. Inside the operating room, the numbers kept falling. "We're losing him," someone said, and no one contradicted it. It happened at 2:46 a.m. His heart, which had been struggling with increasing desperation for 4 hours, simply stopped. Not dramatically. There was no climactic moment, no sudden lurch. It just stopped, the way a conversation sometimes stops, without clear punctuation. And the monitor expressed this stopping as a long, continuous tone. Dr. Reyes called for the defibrillator. They ran 2 rounds. Then a third. The line remained flat. She looked at her team. They looked back at her. Everyone in that room understood what the next 60 seconds meant, and everyone in that room felt the weight of it differently. The resident closest to the door had tears at the corners of his eyes that he was professionally suppressing. The senior nurse had seen this moment many times and it never became ordinary. Dr. Reyes took her mask down. "We've done everything we can," she said. The room began its quiet dismantling. Machines powered down. Gloves came off. Someone moved to note the time. Dr. Reyes looked at Dominic Carerra's face, still finally after 4 hours of fighting, and thought, as she sometimes did in these moments, about how equal this made everyone. How the same. "Time of death," she said and glanced at the clock. 2:47. The door opened. Her name was Rosa Mendez. She was 33 years old, though she looked older on hard nights and younger when she smiled, which she did more than her circumstances logically warranted. She had been cleaning the floors of St. Augustine's Hospital for 6 years on the overnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., pushing her cart through the long fluorescent corridors while the building ran on its nighttime skeleton crew. She was not invisible to everyone. The night nurses knew her by name and saved her the good coffee. An elderly patient on the 4th floor had once given her a birthday card with a $20 bill in it, apologizing that it wasn't more. She kept the card. She spent the 20 on her daughter. But she was invisible to the kind of people who would tonight fill the hallway outside the ICU with their expensive suits and their barely restrained menace. To those people, she was part of the building's infrastructure, like the ventilation system or the overhead lighting, noticed only when malfunctioning. She had learned not to take this personally. She had a philosophy, Rosa, quiet and unspoken and entirely her own, that what mattered was not whether you were seen, but whether you showed up. He showed up. Every night. Rain, exhaustion, whatever the circumstances. On this particular night, she had brought her daughter. This was not standard. This was a consequence of a broken arrangement. The neighbor who usually watched Lily overnight had a family emergency, and Rosa had called everyone she could think of, and in the end there was no one, and she could not miss another shift, so she had bundled Lily up and brought her along, praying the night would be quiet. The night was not quiet. But that turned out, in ways Rosa could not have anticipated, to matter enormously. Lily Mendez was 4 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin and an interest in the world that exceeded, at most moments, her ability to be contained by it. She was supposed to be asleep in Rosa's supply closet, a small room 2 corridors from the ICU where Rosa had made a nest of her jacket and an extra blanket she kept in her cart, where Lily had, in fact, been asleep for 2 hours. Children wake up in the night. This is simply what children do. Lily woke up, found herself alone in a small bright room that smelled of cleaning solution, and did the entirely reasonable thing of going to find her mother. She was small enough that the nurses at the ICU station didn't notice her immediately. She passed below sight lines, navigating the corridor with the absolute confidence of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned that the world has sections labeled not for you. She saw the light under the ICU door. She pushed the door open the way she pushed open every door, with her whole small self. She saw a man lying on a bed. She saw machines. She saw doctors who had stopped moving, standing in that particular heavy stillness of aftermath. She saw, on the face of the man on the bed, something she recognized without having the vocabulary for it. The goneness. The same goneness she had seen on her grandmother's face, 3 years ago, at the end. She was 4. She remembered it anyway. She walked toward him. No one stopped her immediately. The room was in its moment of quiet grief, the machinery of professional response temporarily suspended, and a 4-year-old in a yellow jacket navigating between adult legs registered a half-second later than it should have. By the time it registered, she was at the bed. She was too small to climb up on her own, and so she reached up with both hands and took hold of the rail and hauled herself up with the ungainly, determined athleticism of small children. And then she was on the bed beside him, kneeling, and she was looking at his face. Later Rosa, who had appeared in the doorway by this point, heart in her throat, reaching for her daughter, would describe what she saw as simply, Lily put her hand on his face. Like she was checking. Like she was making sure he was still in there somewhere. And then she leaned down, her dark curls falling forward, and she put her small mouth close to his ear. No one could hear exactly what she said. The room was quiet enough that they could see her lips move. They could see the deliberateness of it. Not a child babbling, but a child saying something specific, chosen, intentional in the way that only very young children can be intentional, without self-consciousness, without calculation. Later Rosa would say that what Lily told her she'd said was, "Don't go yet. I don't want you to go yet." She had called him apparently by a name. Not his name. A name of her own devising, the sleeping man. She had passed this room before, on nights Rosa had brought her. She had seen him through the window before he was critical before the surgery. She had assigned him a name the way children assign names to things they have decided matter. "Don't go yet, sleeping man," she had whispered. "I like you." The monitor that had been showing a flat line for 1 minute and 23 seconds showed something else. It was small. It was the kind of anomaly that a less attentive nurse might have attributed to equipment, to interference, to any of the dozen mundane explanations for anomalous readings. A single spike in the line. Here then gone then. Here again. The nurse closest to the monitor. Her name was Diane, 20 years in the ICU, a person with a finely calibrated instrument for distinguishing real signals from noise, took a step toward the screen. She didn't say anything yet. She didn't want to say anything yet. She watched. The spike came again. Faint. Irregular. Like something knocking on a door from a very great distance. But there. Diane looked at the child on the bed. The child who still had her small hand on the face of a man who had been declared dead approximately 90 seconds ago. The child who was talking to him in a voice too quiet to hear, steady and certain, as if she were simply having a conversation. Diane looked back at the monitor. The spikes were becoming, incrementally, less faint. She pressed the intercom button on the wall. She kept her voice professional, calibrated, betraying nothing of what was crawling up her spine. "Dr. Reyes," she said. "I need you to look at this." Dr. Reyes turned back to the monitor the way you turn back when you've already accepted something and someone tells you to look again, with that particular reluctance that is also, underneath it, a reluctant hope. She looked at the monitor. She looked at it for a long time. "That's..." the resident started. "I see it," she said. "That's not possible," he said. "He was flatlined for..." "I see it," she said again, her voice doing the thing it did when she was thinking hard, flattening, the way a river flattens before it falls. She moved back to the bed. She put her fingers to Dominic's neck, below his jaw, where the carotid was. She closed her eyes. Everyone in the room was holding their breath. "Get the crash cart back," she said quietly. "Doctor." "Get it back," she said. "And get me a pulse ox. And someone get on the phone to cardiology right now, I need..." She paused. She pressed harder against his neck. "I need someone up here in the next 3 minutes." 'Cause there was a pulse. It was weak. It was slow. It was everything that word faint had ever been trying to describe. But it was there, and it was his, and it was new, and it had not been there 140 seconds ago when she had begun to say the time of death. Dr. Reyes looked at the child, who was looking back at her with enormous dark eyes, unsurprised, patient, as if she had known this was the outcome all along. "What is your name?" Dr. Reyes asked. "Lily," the child said. "Lily," Dr. Reyes said. And she had no follow-up. There was nothing medically coherent to say. "Okay," she finally said. "Okay." Marco heard the change in the room, the sudden shift from stillness to movement, voices returning, the specific clatter of medical equipment being repositioned, and he was through the ICU door before he had consciously decided to move. What he saw stopped him. The medical team in renewed motion, machines being reconnected, Dr. Reyes issuing instructions with an intensity that meant something had changed. And on the bed beside Dominic, a child. A small girl in a yellow jacket, sitting beside him like she belonged there. Marco's training overrode his confusion. Unknown person in proximity to Dominic. He moved toward the bed. "Hey!" he started, reaching for Lily. The monitor spiked downward. Everyone heard it. The ascending rhythm that had been building, fragile and improbable, stuttered. The numbers dropped. Dr. Reyes's head came up sharply. "Stop," she said. Marco stopped. He was not a man who stopped for many people. He stopped for Dr. Reyes because her voice carried something he recognized. The authority of someone who understood the specific situation better than he did. "Don't touch her," Dr. Reyes said. She was watching the monitor. "Don't go near her. Don't disturb her." She watched the numbers. She watched them stabilize. She watched the rhythm, cautious and slow, resume its rebuilding. She exhaled. She turned to Marco. "That child does not move," she said. "Not until I say." Marco looked at Lily. Lily looked at Marco. She had, apparently, no idea that she had just done something that would be discussed in medical journals and late-night hospital conversations for years. She looked back at Dominic and patted his hand. "Okay," Marco said. His voice came out strange. He cleared his throat. "Okay." The ethics of it were complicated, and Dr. Reyes had exactly no time for the ethics of it. What she had time for was the monitor, and what the monitor was showing her was that when the child was present and undisturbed, the rhythm strengthened. Minute by minute. She had run enough critical care to know that what she was observing was not something she had a framework for, and she was also practical enough to know that the absence of a framework did not change the data. She found Rosa in the hallway, a small woman with terrified eyes who had been restrained from entering by Marco, which Dr. Reyes corrected immediately. She explained the situation in the plainest terms she had. "Your daughter appears to be helping him," she said. "I can't explain it medically, but his vitals are responding to her presence. I'd like her to stay if you'll allow it." Rosa stared at her. "She's 4 years old." "I know. Who is he? Is he dangerous?" Dr. Reyes considered this. "Right now," she said, "he's barely alive. He's not dangerous to anyone. And I believe your daughter may be helping to keep him that way." Rosa looked through the window at her daughter, who was sitting cross-legged on the hospital bed beside an unconscious man, talking to him in the comfortable way she talked to her stuffed animals at home. She looked back at Dr. Reyes. "She stays with me in sight," Rosa said. "Absolutely," Dr. Reyes said. "And if she wants to leave, she leaves." "Of course." Rosa pushed through the door. She sat in a chair beside the bed. She took her daughter's hand. Lily leaned against her mother without stopping her quiet, steady one-sided conversation with the sleeping man. The monitor held steady, then climbed. The hours between 3 and 6 in the morning have a quality unlike other hours. The city is as quiet as it gets. The hospital runs on its nighttime minimum. The world narrows to what is directly in front of you. In ICU room 4, the world was. The monitor, the machines, the man in the bed, the child who had fallen asleep somewhere around 4 a.m. Not leaving, just finding the natural end of her capacity to stay awake, curled against Dominic's side with the absolute trust of a child who has decided a place is safe. Rosa sat in her chair and watched them both. She had called her neighbor's sister who could come by 6. She had called her supervisor. She sat. Marco stood near the door, which meant the other guards stood near the door, which meant there was a loose cluster of large men in dark suits who were maintaining a silence so complete it had its own texture. They were watching the child. All of them, at various points in the night, looked at that child and then looked away quickly, doing something private with their faces. These were men whose lives were built on power, on the premise that strength determined outcomes, on the understanding that the world bent to the application of sufficient force. None of them had any framework for this. The monitor showed a heart rate of 51 beats per minute at 3 a.m., 58 at 4, 64 at 5. Dr. Reyes came back every 40 minutes and stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the numbers and at the child and did not say what she was thinking, because what she was thinking was not medical. The night held. The machines held. The child slept. Rosa sat in that chair through the long night and remembered something she had not thought about in 2 years. She had been in her 4th year at the hospital. It was February, and her landlord had given her an eviction notice. Not because she wasn't paying, but because the building had been purchased by a development company and the new owners wanted the units empty. She had 30 days. She had nowhere to go. She had Lily, who was 2, and a salary that made the rent on any comparable apartment in the city a mathematical impossibility. She had told no one at the hospital. She was private about these things, Rosa. You dealt with what you had and you didn't display it. But she remembered that a week after the notice, she had received a letter from her landlord's office stating that her eviction had been rescinded. No explanation. And her rent for the following 6 months had been paid. Anonymously, a bank transfer, originating from a holding company that meant nothing to her. She had never connected it. But sitting in that room, looking at the face of the man in the bed, something tugged at a memory. The building she lived in, the management company that owned it, a name she had seen on paperwork. Carerra Holdings. She looked at him. At the still face. The lines of a life that had not been easy, whatever its power. She thought about the fact that she had never known. That he had never known her. How could he? She was invisible to him, she had always assumed. And yet somehow, from somewhere, something had redirected. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe it was coincidence. But she sat with it through the long night, this maybe, and it changed the texture of how she looked at him. At 6:12 a.m., the sky outside the ICU window began to change. This sounds like metaphor. It was also just weather. The particular gray to pink transition of a winter dawn, thin light coming through windows that faced east, landing on the floor in pale rectangles. Lily was still asleep. At 6:15, the monitor showed a heart rate of 72 beats per minute. Normal range. For a man who had flatlined 6 hours ago, the word normal had never been so extraordinary. Dr. Reyes stood at the foot of the bed and looked at her clipboard and looked at the numbers and looked at the clipboard again. The cardiologist who had come in at 3 a.m. stood beside her. They had been through this together, the watching of the numbers climbing through the night, and they had not talked much because there was nothing useful to say. They were doctors. They knew what should have happened. They were looking at what had happened instead. His pressure, Dr. Reyes asked. 110/70, the nurse said. As of 10 minutes ago. Brain activity. Consistent. No signs of deficit. Dr. Reyes nodded slowly. The cardiologist, who was a man not given to sentiment, said, "In 30 years, I have never seen anything like this." "I know," Dr. Reyes said. "The literature doesn't." "I know." They stood in the morning light. In the bed, the man who should have been dead breathed steadily. Against his side, the child who had talked him back from wherever he had gone slept with complete serenity, one small hand still resting on his arm. It happened at 7:04 a.m. Lily had woken up. She was eating crackers from her mother's bag, sitting cross-legged at the foot of the bed now, watching Dominic with the unself-conscious attentiveness of a child who has decided someone is interesting. Rosa had told her gently that they would need to leave soon. Lily had said okay in a way that meant she was still evaluating. Marco was at the door. He had not left. He would not leave until Dominic told him to or until something changed. And for 6 hours nothing had changed, and then everything had. Dominic's left hand moved. Just the fingers. The smallest possible motion. The hand registering something, reaching for something it couldn't name. Marco saw it and crossed the room in 3 steps and then stopped himself, because don't disturb anything, Dr. Reyes had said, and he was holding that instruction with everything he had. Then the eyelids. Low. Heavy. The kind of opening that is working against enormous resistance, like a door that has been sealed for too long. But opening. Lily stopped eating her cracker. His eyes opened. Dark, the same as always. Marco almost made a sound, swallowed it. Dominic stared at the ceiling for a moment with a blank, unfocused look of a person re-establishing their relationship with existence. Then his eyes moved. They found the child at the foot of the bed. Lily waved. A small, confident wave, cracker in hand. Something moved across Dominic Carerra's face that no one in that room had ever seen on it before. It was not an expression his face had practiced. It arrived anyway. His throat was raw from the intubation. His voice, when it came, was barely a voice. More the memory of one, thin and scraped sounding, words assembled with obvious effort. Dr. Reyes was in the room within 60 seconds of Marco's call. She was running assessments, light in his eyes, grip strength, orientation. She was asking him questions and he was managing minimal responses, which was medically appropriate and medically remarkable. Then he turned his head toward the child. Rosa had Lily by the hand now, prepared to take her out. Dominic looked at the child with those dark eyes, still hazy, still reassembling themselves, and he worked his mouth around something. They all leaned in slightly. The medical staff, the guards, Rosa. The word that came out, or the two words barely audible, one breath's worth of sound, were, "You stayed." Lily looked at him with the directness of 4-year-olds, who have not learned to look away from things that are true. "I didn't want you to go," she said, exactly as she had said it into his ear in the dark. Dominic Carerra looked at her for a long time. His jaw moved. He was trying for something, and the something was difficult, and his face did the difficult work of it. "Thank you," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. These were reported by everyone present as the two hardest words they had ever heard a person say. Not because they were complicated words, but because of what it cost him to say them, and because of how completely he meant them. The case, when it was written up, anonymized, submitted to 2 different cardiology journals, declined by one and accepted by another with significant caveats, used language like spontaneous cardiac recovery and anomalous revival following confirmed asystole and stimulus response mechanism not yet understood. What it could not use was the accurate language, which was, "A child whispered to him and he came back." Dr. Reyes gave 2 interviews in the following weeks, to publications that heard about the case through hospital channels. In both interviews she was careful. She used her medical vocabulary. She did not speculate. But when a journalist from one of the publications asked her, off the record, what she actually believed had happened, she was quiet for a moment. "I've been in medicine for 22 years, she finally said. "I have a very high tolerance for not knowing. What I believe is that the human body is responsive to things we haven't finished measuring yet. Connection, presence, being called back by someone who means it." He paused. "She meant it," Dr. Reyes said. Whatever she said to him, she meant it entirely. "And I think on some level we don't have instruments for," he heard her. The journalist asked if she believed in miracles. Dr. Reyes considered this. "I believe in outcomes that exceed my model," she said. "I'll keep updating the model." By 9 a.m., the news had moved through certain channels. The man who had ordered the assassination attempt. His name was Victor Solano, and he ran operations in 4 cities, and he had spent 14 years accumulating a list of reasons to want Dominic Carerra removed from the equation, received this news while eating breakfast in his home in the hills above the city. He received it from a hospital contact he maintained for exactly this kind of intelligence. The contact was brief. Subject survived. ICU but stable. Unclear prognosis. Victor set down his coffee cup. He had been careful. The device, the timing, the 4 men. It had been clean, or it should have been clean. He had allowed himself, over the last 6 hours, the cautious beginning of relief. He picked the cup back up. He looked out the window at the hills. "Get me Carrera's security roster," he said to the man standing to his left. "I want to know which of his people are at the hospital and which are not. And I want options, for if he recovers fully." The man to his left nodded and left the room. Victor drank his coffee. He looked at the hills. He was calculating the way he always calculated, working the variables. Dominic had survived once. He had survived 4 times now, technically if you counted last night twice. Once from the explosion and once from what the hospital contact had described with confused vagueness as something to do with a child. Victor did not find miracles concerning. He found the logistics of a second attempt concerning, and he began to work on them. He didn't know yet that Dominic had already received his name. Memory returned to Dominic in the non-linear way that consciousness returns after trauma. Not a straight line but a series of retrievals, pieces assembling themselves without a guaranteed order. The dinner. Teo's window exploding. The parking structure. The stairwell. The rain on the pavement of the street. The strange patience of it. And before that, the conversation 2 weeks ago with Marco about a rumor from one of their intelligence contacts, about Victor Solano, about a meeting in a neutral city, about money moving in directions it shouldn't move. He had filed it. He had not yet acted on it. He filed things. He was very good at remembering what he had filed. He lay in the ICU bed and he was quiet and he let his mind do its work. His body was damaged in ways that would take months to address. His left side was a catalogue of reconstructed structures that would need careful management. He would be here for weeks. He would be limited for longer. None of this changed what he knew and what he would, in time, do with what he knew. But it was not what he was thinking about primarily in those first waking hours. What he was thinking about was a voice in the dark, small, certain, completely without agenda, telling him not to go yet. He was thinking about the fact that it had reached him. Whatever distance he had traveled toward whatever was on the other side, that voice had reached. He was thinking about what that meant. He was not yet sure what it meant, but it felt like something that required a response beyond the strategic. He asked for Marco at 10 a.m., when he had enough voice to sustain a conversation and enough clarity to make it coherent. Marco sat in the chair beside the bed with the strained composure of a man who had spent the last several hours managing an emotion he didn't have a name for, and he listened while Dominic spoke, slowly and with effort, about what he wanted done. The woman, cleaner, and her daughter, Rosa Mendez, Marco said. He had learned her name by 7 a.m. Marco was thorough. Find out everything. What she needs. Where she lives. Whether the situation is stable. Pause, breath conserved. If it isn't stable, make it stable. Already started, Marco said. Dominic looked at him. The child didn't leave, Marco said, in explanation or perhaps just as information he needed to convey. Through all of it. I tried to move her and... He stopped. It didn't help you. When we moved her. So we let her stay. I know, Dominic said. She's 4. I know. Marco was quiet for a moment. Then, she waved at you. When you opened your eyes. You just wave. With a cracker. Something moved across Dominic's face again. He looked at the ceiling. The safe house on the north side, he said. Offer it to them. Not an order. An offer. The woman can refuse. She may refuse, Marco said. Then find another way to make sure they're protected. Victor will know I survived. He'll be looking for pressure points. His voice was controlled. Flat. The familiar flatness. They don't become a pressure point. Understood, Marco said. He started to stand. Dominic stopped him. How did she do it, he asked. Marco sat back down. For the first time in 11 years, he didn't have an answer. Recovery was slow. Dominic was not a patient, which was both predictable and complicated. He managed it, though. He managed it because something had shifted in the way he was spending his thinking time. He had always been strategic. The quality of his attention had always been a formidable thing, the way it focused on outcomes and worked backward through variables. This had not changed. But he found himself also spending time on things that were not strategic in any conventional sense. He spent time thinking about Teo, who had been with him 9 years and who was dead because of a window. He spent time thinking about his mother, who had come to sit with him every day since he woke up and who was older than he had allowed himself to notice. He spent time thinking about the men who stood outside his room, who had given their lives to standing outside his room, and whether he had considered carefully enough what he was asking them to spend their lives on. He spent time thinking about a woman who cleaned floors overnight for wages that were, by any reasonable measure, insufficient, who had a daughter, and had somehow raised that daughter to be the kind of person who would climb onto a stranger's bed in a hospital and tell him not to go. Not because of money. Not because of power. Because she didn't want him to. Like you. She hadn't known him. She had decided from a window, from a child's unreasoned instinct, that he was worth liking, worth staying for. He thought about what it would mean to be worth that. Actually worth it. Not feared. Not powerful. Genuinely worth a 4-year-old's decision to stay. He was discharged, against Dr. Reyes's strong preference, 5 weeks after admission. He was not fully recovered. He would not be fully recovered for months. He moved carefully, rested more than he ever had, and made decisions from a position of physical limitation that would previously have been intolerable to him. Turned out that limitation clarified things. The question of Victor Solano was resolved, ultimately, not through violence, though there were elements of that chapter that were not clean. It was resolved through strategy, through financial instruments and legal mechanisms, and the patient assembly of evidence that had been, for years, available to be assembled. Dominic handed the relevant materials to people in positions to act on them. He pulled certain threads and allowed certain structures to collapse. Victor's operations unraveled over 3 months. Victor himself faced the consequences of a paper trail that had always existed and that Dominic had simply waited to deploy. He had done it this way not from weakness, from choice. He had looked at the available methods and selected the one that would be definitive without costing him what the other methods would cost. He was still strategic. He was still precise. But the calculation had acquired a new variable. What did he want the rest of this to look like? Not the empire. Himself. What did he want to have spent his life building? He was 44 years old. He had been told he was dead and he had come back. This felt like information. He did not become a different person. That kind of story is simpler than the truth. He was still Dominic Carerra. He was still the man whose name rearranged rooms. He was still capable of the precision that had always characterized his most effective decisions, and he was still, in certain moods, formidable in ways that had nothing to do with his physical size. But the empire over the following year changed shape. He divested from 3 operations that had always been, by any honest accounting, on the wrong side of things he now found he cared about. He did this systematically, deliberately, without announcement. He restructured others. He invested quietly and significantly in things that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with infrastructure. A hospital wing, a housing development in 2 neighborhoods that had been systematically underserved, an educational endowment. He demanded more from the people around him. Not more loyalty, he had always had that. He demanded more honesty. More willingness to tell him when he was wrong. He found, to his mild surprise, that people were capable of this when you made it safe to do it. He had dinner with his mother every Sunday. He had not done this before. He visited Dr. Reyes once, 6 months after his discharge, to thank her in person. She received this with professional grace and told him plainly that she was glad he had survived and that she hoped he was making good use of it. Working on it, he said. She seemed to find this adequate. It was a year after the night in question, and spring, and the event was technically a private dinner, a term Dominic still used for gatherings that were smaller and more deliberate than public occasions. Rosa Mendez had accepted the offer of the safe house for 3 months following the assassination attempt, during which time a different situation had been arranged. An apartment in a quieter neighborhood, at a rent that Rosa had initially refused and then accepted after a conversation with Dominic in which he had explained that he was not doing her a favor. He was correcting a debt. She still worked at the hospital. He had offered her other work, better paid, and she had said she preferred to stay, and he had respected this immediately and without pushing, which she noted and appreciated. Lily was 5 now. She had started school. She was, by Rosa's accounting, still the most curious person in any room she occupied, still entirely unafraid of strangers, still convinced that most people were, at baseline, worth liking. At the dinner, which was small, Marco, 2 others, Rosa, Lily, Dominic's mother, Dominic gave a brief speech, which was not something he normally did. He was not a man for speeches. He said, "I was told I was gone. I believed it. And someone who had no reason to care whether I came back or not decided, for reasons she has never fully explained and that I am not sure are explicable, that I should." He looked at Lily, who was eating dessert with the focused attention she gave to most things. "I owe you something I can't calculate," he said to her. "You came to find me when I was somewhere very far away. You called me back. I don't know how you reached me. I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worth the fact that you did." Lily looked up from her dessert. She considered this. "Okay," she said. "Can I have more cake?" Dominic Carerra laughed. It was a real laugh, uncalculated, arriving without his permission. Marco, across the table, looked away and composed himself. Yes, Dominic said. You can have more cake. There is a version of this story that is about power. About a man who built an empire and survived its enemies and emerged, against all probability, intact. About strategy and loyalty and the particular kind of strength that comes from knowing how to outlast people who want you gone. That story is true. But it is not the whole story. The whole story is about a 4-year-old in a yellow jacket who climbed onto a hospital bed at 2:47 in the morning and told a dying man she didn't want him to go. It is about the fact that she reached him. That through whatever distance separates the living from what lies beyond. However you understand that distance, whatever framework you bring to it, her voice found him. An unguarded voice, without strategy or agenda or request for anything in return. Just I like you. Don't go yet. And he came back. The doctors could not explain it. The cardiologists could not explain it. Dr. Reyes, who was a scientist and a pragmatist and one of the finest trauma physicians in the city, chose language like stimulus response mechanisms not yet understood and knew that she was describing, with the tools she had, something that exceeded the tools. What is not explicable by the tools is sometimes most worth paying attention to. What brought Dominic Carerra back was not the surgeons, though they fought for him and their skill mattered. It was not his money, which could buy many things and could not buy one more second of a flatlined heart. It was not his power which could move cities and could not move a single machine back into life. It was a child who had decided from a window that he was worth staying for. And the thing about love, uncalculated, unearned, offered without guarantee of return, is that it finds you in the dark, crosses distances that nothing else can cross. It calls you by a name that isn't even your name and somehow you know it means you. He came back. And he tried for the rest of his days to be worth it. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more powerful stories of miracles, redemption, and the unexpected ways love changes everything. And tell us, do you believe that miracles can happen through love? Drop "miracles exist" in the comments, or just tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your presence here means more than you know.